Well, hello everyone. This is Gene Rice, once again, recording from the lovely confines of the Forsyth Library at Fort Hays State University, where I'm an associate professor of philosophy. And this video lecture series is one of a combined three. The title for this particular presentation is Communitarianism, Philosophical Challenges to the Liberal Tradition. And as it notes there on the PowerPoint slide, which you should have available to you up on Blackboard or as a handout, this will be the first of three connected presentations, all having to do with various elements of communitarianism. So this time we'll spend a little bit of effort looking at the philosophical challenges, and then later on we'll look at some of the more political challenges to Western liberalism. So let's begin by looking at a quote from a famous American philosopher, a Western philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre. The quote is, "Morality, which is no particular society's morality, is to be found nowhere." As you can guess, communitarianism comes from the word community. And MacIntyre is pointing out that you never find moralities without communities or without societies. And so MacIntyre is critiquing any attempt to create or to justify morality without talking about the society or the community in particular. So communitarianism is a name of a philosophical movement that began in the West in the 1960s and 70s with John Rawls' view of social contractarianism. We've already looked at that a little bit. It is also more than a philosophical movement, and we're going to look at some of the political objections to liberalism in other presentations. As we'll see, although communitarianism as a movement arose in the West fairly recently, many of the objections are in fact very ancient objections. And some of the objections will come from Chinese and from Asian cultures or from Western cultures who are much older than the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, that grouping there that we tend to think of as the Western tradition. So let's begin then to look a little bit more at communitarianism. I'll put up here a definition. This is the definition that comes out of Wentz's book, which you are probably using for this course. If not, that's fine. This is still a good definition of communitarianism. Communitarianism, then, is a political philosophy according to which personal identity of an individual involves group membership, and the state should foster maintenance of practices that advance social solidarity and perfectionist ideals over individual autonomy. Well, that's a mouthful, and we'll spend the rest of this video lecture and a couple of more filling that picture in, or teasing apart that very long definition that we just gave you. But nonetheless, that's a starting point, and as we go through, by the end, hopefully it will make more sense to you than perhaps it does now. All right, so as I've already hinted, the presentation today will be more about some of the philosophical criticisms to liberalism that fall under the heading communitarianism. In the second of the three lectures, we'll look at some internal and external political challenges. And then in the third, we'll look at the issue of human rights and Asian values. So these three lectures together will help us understand not only what communitarianism is, but why it arose philosophically and politically. Okay, so let's review then here a little bit on some of the central themes that we've been working on this semester. The work so far has covered a number of issues in ethics and political philosophy, including a number of political theories, libertarianism, welfare liberalism, social contractarianism, and so forth. And what I want to do now is identify four central themes that all of these approaches accept. Now, they may have some differences in how they interpret these 4 themes, but nonetheless, all 4 would be an important part of any of the political theories we've looked at up to this point. The first is individualism, that communities do not have priority, rather individuals within communities have priority. Sometimes this is called atomism, which again suggests independence, right? An atom is a singular particle different than others, just like an individual would be a single particle different than others in the community. The second theme, which you've been considering this semester, is what's called liberalism, which again suggests that the value of individual freedom has priority over other political values. The combination of individualism and liberalism will create 2 more themes. The first being state neutrality. Government in a liberal society is usually understood as having as its primary goal being neutral with respect to individual life goals. That is, we don't tell everyone that they have to become doctors or religious citizens or something like that. You get to choose what you want to do, and so the state is neutral. They're like a referee. They allow various people to pursue their own individual life goals or their own values. And finally, this will be the topic of the third and last lecture on communitarianism. When you combine individualism and liberalism, you often get an emphasis on protecting human rights. That is, the goal of government is understood as protecting or enforcing human rights, allowing then individuals to be free. So, if we put those 4 together, then we have what I will call, I'll call it a number of things. I'll call it liberalism or Western liberalism or even Western political tradition. But basically, any of those will refer to these 4 elements. And communitarianism is a different approach. It is an approach which either rejects one or more of these theses or lessens their importance. So when we look at these various objections, they will, many of them, be directed to individual parts of these theses or in some cases, to more than one put together. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and we'll go to the board here and talk a little bit about some of the arguments for communitarianism. If we So we'll abbreviate communitarianism COM. We're going to look at 2 primary arguments. There are a lot more than just this, and as you see, these arguments themselves are pretty complicated, or can be complicated or complex, but we'll try and just stick to these 2 for now, and you may come up with more than these 2 arguments in your class discussions. The first argument is that for communitarianism is that individuals always exist in communities. If we look at any particular individual, we will see that they belong to one or more, in many cases, a large variety of communities. So if you take myself, for example, I have a family. Of course, I was born into a family. In fact, there is no person who can create their own birth single-handedly. It's impossible. And babies who are left without communities will usually end up dying pretty quickly. So I belong to a family, my parents, my brothers and sisters, and I am married now and I have children of my own, so I belong then to a second family, right, an additional community. I also belong to lots of other communities. I belong to, so we could look at my birth family, and then my wife and children, and then you could say the city of Hayes, right? I belong to that. And then another community I belong to is the United States, maybe, or a religious community might be important. So if you look at me as an example, you'll see that from the communitarian perspective, the emphasis on individuals is mistaken. It's mistaken factually, that is, that people don't exist all by themselves, sort of wandering off into space. And it's also, it's wrong in terms of our value orientation. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So suppose a Western liberal says, well, wait a minute. If I really wanted, I could go out into the desert and live by myself. Well, I suppose that's at least possible, although if you drive out into the desert, you're relying on the community that built your car, which would involve thousands of people. It would, if you're driving on roads, you didn't build those roads yourself, right? You need gas, you didn't pull the gas out of the earth, and so forth. And if you use tools while you're out in the desert to make a living, I don't know how you would do that, but if you were to do that, you would be doing things that involve other people's efforts. And so it would be very hard, and in fact, it is very hard to really live entirely outside of communities. And that's probably why very few people do it. Another reason why very few people do it is because that people are happier in communities. Because our communities are where we find our value and our happiness. So, the communitarian says that the focus on individuals is mistaken. That in fact, not only do we live in communities, we should live in communities, because this is where we have our best chance for happiness. This is where we get our values. If you think of where your own values come from, right, it's likely that your own community, your family and your friends and your culture have all greatly affected your values, what it is that you think is important, whether you're a religious person or not, whether you think it's good to be a lawyer or a doctor, whether you want to get married, whether you think money is important. Those kind of values come from your community. All right? And there's one last element of this argument, or part of this argument, that says that if you focus on individuals instead of communities, you end up with selfish humans, right? Uncaring humans, people who are focused only on themselves. Perhaps you know somebody who's very selfish, and they are always putting their own good in front of the communities. And so this would be the final argument, or the final element in this first argument for communitarianism, right? So, in terms of both facts and values, the communitarian says we should look or emphasize communities instead of individuals. Okay, so that's basically a summary and maybe a little visual, or very little visual there on that first argument. Let's look now at the second argument. The second argument is the argument that culture, very broadly defined, or our society, our community, defines who or what we think about morality. So when we think of our everyday moral experience, that is, when we think about what it is to be a good person in the world, or what we think it is to be a bad person in the world, our sense of rightness and wrongness come from our culture. They come from our community. And so the communitarian argues that we can't talk about justice or good or bad government or right or wrong behavior independent of our culture, right? Our community. And so we could go back again to that first quote we don't have to go back to that, but that first quote from Alistair MacIntyre says, morality, which is no particular society's morality, is not to be found. Each of us comes from a community, and that community helps provide what our moral responsibilities are. So we can fill that out a little bit as well. When we think about what it is to be a moral person, what our moral responsibilities are, we see very quickly that almost all of our moral responsibilities come within the relationships of our community. So, in fact, it's hard to think of moral responsibilities we have that don't function as a part of our community. So again, we'll take me as an example. Because I happen to be the only one here. My moral responsibilities, for example, to my children, are some of the most important things I have to do. When I get home at the end of the day, I have things I have to do. I have to help my son with his homework. And I have to help my daughter with piano lessons, and my son too. Actually, I can't do that because I don't know piano, but my wife does that. And so we have things that we're morally responsible to do, to teach our children good from bad and so forth. And those are important parts of what it is to be me, right? What it is to have my moral outlook on the world. And so the communitarian says that that most of our moral responsibilities come to us through our community. And many of these are not chosen. Right? Now, in fact, in the case of children, usually that is chosen. People decide to have children and try to have children and want to have children, not always. But let's take a different example. My parents, my mother and father are both alive, and at some point they may get ill or aged, and I will have the responsibility to take care of them. And I did not choose my parents. None of us got to choose our parents, right? So many of our moral responsibilities are inherited. I inherited living in a certain part of the country. Now, of course, I can move in some cases, but it's unlikely that I could move too far away. And even if I did, I would simply substitute a different location for my moral responsibilities. Okay. So the last point there, then, if we go back to that slide, is also related to this point, which just says that when we're talking about our moral responsibilities, they don't have so much to do with these very grand or universal moral claims like human rights. I'm not worried in my day-to-day life about world justice. And I'm not really responsible so much for helping people in other parts of the world, their security rights or their political responsibilities or something like that. So the communitarian says then, we take this all together, that culture defines our sense of morality. And that's an important argument against what they see as an excessive kind of emphasis that Western liberal societies have on separating morality from culture. Okay, so let's look then at how communitarianism will critique the various elements of traditional Western liberalism. Recall that the first element was individualism. So the communitarian wants to moderate what they see as the excessive individualism of Western countries like the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. And so what they would advocate, or what they would hope to change, is, for example, to carry out our existing moral responsibilities to our families. A very good example of this in the United States is our responsibility to our parents. In other cultures, particularly non-Western cultures, one of the most important virtues of all is taking care of your parents. And it would be a great shame were a son or a daughter to not take care of their parents when they got older. In the United States, many people, many elderly people live in what we call old folks' homes. basically places where other people will take care of older people. Now, in some cases, this is unavoidable because children have died or cannot take care of their parents for whatever reason. But in many cases in the United States, children do not necessarily take great responsibility in caring for their aged parents. So this would be an example, one small example, of where the communitarian would say there ought to be a change. We can't have people saying, well, I'm a free individual and I don't have to take care of my parents, and besides, I'd rather spend the money on something else, like a new car or to the casino or something like that. Okay, so the second item there under the communitarian critique of individualism, a critique meaning just here criticisms, would be to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of our own tradition. And again, the communitarians here say we need to know the tradition in order to recognize its strengths and weaknesses. And then lastly, then we can want to carry on our tradition, to modify it and to correct it and to apply it to new situations. So let's take an example here of items B and C. Again, in Western cultures, some traditions live on and some traditions have fallen away or have gone away. So we might think of traditions of honoring our war veterans, for example. In some places in the country, people do not really celebrate the days that we set aside in the United States to honor war veterans. In the old days, in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, there probably was a much greater emphasis on taking part in ceremonies like visiting cemeteries where war veterans were buried and so forth. And nowadays, many people do not follow through with this tradition. And so that might be an example where the communitarian would say, this is a tradition which should be carried on. We can't let that fall apart or fall by the wayside. And another example would be a case where a community needs to confront a problem. We could think of like the terrorist attacks of September 11th on the United States, or any sort of violent uprising. Countries will periodically have to face these kinds of terrible situations, and we need to know the culture and the traditions in order to apply them to new situations and to try and overcome new problems or new challenges to our system. These aren't always violent, of course. We could think of like the television or the internet has posed new challenges to cultures, and so cultures have to respond to that. Are we going to let our kids watch all the TV they want? Are we not going to watch any TV? Is the internet good? Is it bad? It's up to communities, according to communitarianism, communities and governments to help people meet new challenges and new opportunities. So that's a critique of individualism. Let's move on to the critique of state neutrality. The alternative to state neutrality is called perfectionism. Again, here I'll give you this definition from Wentz. The book defines it as perfectionism as the view that the state should sponsor a particular vision of virtue and of the good life. So if we were to go up here and compare these two then just very briefly here, you have state neutrality on the one side, on the liberal side, and on the communitarian side you would have what is called perfectionism. Perfectionism comes from the word perfection. Communitarians do not believe that we have to be perfect. What the word suggests is that we are aiming for progress, right? To become better, to get better. And to be better, to get better in progress requires a goal, right? If I told you, well, just get better, without telling you what I wanted you to get better at, you would not know what it is that you were supposed to be doing to get better. So, the liberal position says that government should be like a referee, that you could have various views of the good life, and as long as you weren't hurting anyone else, you were free to pursue any of these versions of the good life. So version A might be being involved in your community or being very religious, and version B might be trying to get rich, and version C might be trying to get married, and version D might be doing anything but getting married, and version E might be, going to the moon or something like that, becoming an astronaut. And according to the liberal view, government isn't supposed to endorse any of these particular views, just as long as you can do whatever you want, as long as you're not hurting other people. You're not harming their particular rights. But the communitarian says, well, suppose that this view of the good life is selfish and shallow, right? You think the best thing in the world is watching TV and drinking beer, right? That would be a shallow view of what it is to be human, and you don't want to have any friends or anything. Well, according to liberalism, as long as you're not hurting anybody else, that's perfectly fine. So perfectionism says that the government's job is to help us become more virtuous and to create a better society or a better community, to become more perfect. All right? So a perfectionist government might try to persuade, either through law or through other cultural means or practices, might try to prevent people from, from becoming D, right? From endorsing whatever this particular picture of the good life is, right? So on the communitarian view, there would be far fewer acceptable kinds of life. There may not be just one, but there would be, ideally, there would be a pretty clearly defined goal, and then people would be able to follow it. And government's job is to help people achieve more virtue in a better and more functional, flourishing community. Okay, so that would be a critique there, or an alternative to state neutrality. So the next slide there just outlines some of those items I just talked about. And the last item there just suggests that perfectionist states may not necessarily see the goal of government as being protecting people's human rights. And we're going to spend some time on this in the third lecture, so I won't talk any more about it now. Okay, the last slide here, or the last thing to mention, is just that there are plenty of examples of non-liberal societies. And in fact, if you were to count up all the communities or the societies in the world, there would be a heck of a lot more non-liberal societies than there would be liberal societies. Sometimes students and citizens in the West tend to forget that modern Western liberalism is a fairly recent phenomenon. And so we could look to ancient cultures or modern examples to find non-liberal societies in the sense of societies which do not subscribe to all four of our of the elements of modern Western liberalism. Okay, so we will leave it there for now and give you a chance to try and digest some of this in your other work outside of this lecture, and we'll be back with other lectures to follow, which will help sort of fill out the communitarian ideal, and in more specific cases, look at some of the problems that have developed for liberal societies, both within and in their interactions with other cultures, that have led communitarians to offer alternative views. So until then, take care.